Got 2013 Hyundai Sonata SE. You're gonna do front brakes on it. All you wanna do is you wanna jack it up, support it. And before you take your tires off, try shaking the wheel right to left, you know? See if there's any play in a tie rod end, or maybe even come down here, a ball joint, from up here up to the top and bottom, and rock it back and forth, see if you got a bad wheel bearing. Check out your strut, make sure it's not leaking real bad or a broken spring, okay? Then you also want to check out your tire tread, make sure you don't have any bands or cords sticking out. Reason is, check it before you take the tire off, because it's easier to use the tire to check parts. And also before you're actually getting into the repair, so you know what to be aware of and what you might need. If it has a bad tie rod end, you're gonna find that out right now before you take it apart. So it's always nice to know ahead of time. Okay, so we're gonna remove the tire. The lug nuts are 21s, so we'll get them off. Yeah, see the tire's off. Looks like the rotor's pretty new and in pretty decent shape. Decent shaped looking pads. Okay, but the inside of this rotor is all rusted from sitting. When the vehicle sits too much, the rotors will condensate, sweat, because it's a smooth, shiny surface, and then they'll start rusting, and then that's when you start getting your pitting and rusting on your rims. But also, this thing had brakes put on a year ago, and here's the problem. See the caliper? See the rim? Caliper, rim. No clearance. Okay? See the bottom? Let's see if you can get in there. You see the clearance? You see the gap right here? See that gap? See that gap? Gap, no gap. What happened was, they didn't torque their caliper bracket bolt, and the whole caliper assembly slid into the rim and locks up in reverse, okay? If it was the bottom one, it'd be the same way except in drive. So the threads on the caliper bracket are all stripped out, so we're gonna have to replace the caliper with the bracket. Plus I showed you on the other side that the rotors are getting a lot of pitting and rusting on the so we're just gonna go ahead and replace the brakes complete. Okay. If you can't get the tire off, you have to hit it with a hammer. What you want to do is you want to put a lug nut on there to hold it from falling out and damaging something else. And so you hit the back side of the rim with a big lead mallet or a hammer with a piece of wood. Okay. Here's your caliper. That's the way I got it. You can see it was rubbing when you're applying the brakes also. You can see the nice shiny groove we put in the rim. So we'll go ahead and we'll finish taking these all apart. Well, here it is. There's the caliper. That's what happens when you don't have them bolts tight. So hits the inside the rim, or it hits the rotor. So that's what happens when you don't torque your bolts. Do you know what happens when you don't tighten up your caliper bracket bolts or even your caliper bolt? Especially if it's the top one. Well, when you go in reverse and you hit your brakes, the caliper goes like that, and then it hits the inside the rim and locks it up. And if the top one bolt came out and you apply your brakes, then just do the opposite, the other direction, so you can't go forward. This is what happens when you do not torque your caliper bolts or your caliper bracket bolts. And on this particular one, it was loose for a while, so the threads in the caliper bracket are all stripped out and gone. So I'll have to replace the caliper bracket. So that's what happens when somebody does a brake job and they do not torque the caliper bolts or caliper bracket bolts. Should always double check your work. Good luck. Well, here it is. There's the caliper. That's what happens when you don't have them bolts tight. So, hits the inside the rim, or it hits the rotor. So that's what happens when you don't torque your bolts. Okay. Caliper bolts are 14 millimeter. There's two of them. One here and one down here. If they just turn and the slide pin just turns with them, then you have to get some needle nose vice grips and clamp on them to hold them from turning. Then you can get your bolts out. You get your bolts out, then you want to pry your caliper out from your bracket. You know, get in there like that. Pry it away a little bit. Get it away a little bit, then you can get a screwdriver in here. Get in there like that, and then you can push against the piston a little bit. Push that piston in. If you can. Just a little bit. Okay, once you get it out, get loose, you can pull the whole thing off. Some of the pistons are plastic, so you don't want to get on them and chip them and break them. These are pretty nasty, all rusted. So on this one particular vehicle, we're gonna replace them because of the problem we have in the beginning. Okay. There's two style calipers, sport and non-sport. I don't know. Okay, so now we're gonna take the caliper bracket off. You know, I have to get the sizes for that. My caliper brackets are a 17. And what I did was break them loose. I get a wrench in there, get the wrench on it, and then I hit the end of my wrench with a hammer, 3-pound sledge, to break them loose. And then I use my impact with a 17 millimeter on it, or you can use your 17 millimeter ratchet wrench if you have one. And then get your bracket off. And this is what it looks like. Threads in this one are good. So, so what we're gonna do is take this apart and clean it up and put new pads on there. And a bundle clips. So I'll show you that in a little bit. Here's the rotor. It's stuck on there. They didn't put the bolts back in. So I'm not gonna keep this rotor, I'm gonna get a new one. Usually you hit them right here. Pretty good. Then I have to hit the threads on the studs, or I'll go around and hit the rotor. See how that happened? Right. Okay, we got the rotor off. See the hub? It's all rusty, nasty. All right. Looks like right here is where the screws were, and they're sticking out a little bit. So if you get the rotor on there, when that's where the screws holes aren't, then your rotor's gonna not sit on there flat. So I'm gonna grind them down anyway. Let's see if I can turn them, but they won't turn. So we'll clean that up with an angle die grinder with a disc on it. Nice brand new screwdriver to get in here, scratch that all up. And a wire brush. I'm not actually trying to remove any metal. I just want to shine it, scratch it, okay? Here's the hub, nice and shiny. And then I got a die grinder. Cut off, I can ground them down. So it doesn't matter where I put the rotor. So it's all clean. And I'll put a light film of anti-seize on it before I put my rotor on. And I used a roll-lock disc to clean them up. New screwdriver, get inside between the studs. Wire brush. I'm not actually removing any metal, I just want to shine it up. These things will remove metal. You gotta do it lightly. Okay. New rotor, took it out of the plastic, has a light film of oil on it. Here you need to use soap and water to remove that, or degreaser, or some Windex. Do not use brake clean. New style brake pads, do not use brake clean. Brake clean will eat the pad material, even though you wiped it off. Still residue on there. So, no brake clean on brake parts. Only cleaning up different things like the hub. Nothing to do with the brakes. Okay. Light film of anti-seize on my hub. I put just a little bit on my threads. And that's it. So now my rotor's cleaned. I put my rotor on there and I'll put a nut on it to hold it from flopping around. Or a small pair of vice grips. I'm getting new calipers, so you'll need to separate the caliper from the caliper bracket. 14s. These are rebuilts, so hopefully they plenty of grease, silk glide inside there. Should be good. What I always do if this is a used caliper, when it's on the car, like that. See underneath where a bundle clip goes, it's all rust. Rust expands. So the rust expands, it pushes on the pads. It makes the pads tight, so it doesn't allow the pad to move freely inside that bracket. So if you're using the original caliper bracket, you want to clean that all up. Use your die grinder with your little disc on there and clean it up. And then I'll paint them. I'll paint them to help prevent them from rusting. I don't know. That's how it works. Get your new abundant clips in there. Make sure you push them in all the way because they sit in between here. Push them down. Make sure they're flat. Sometimes you might want to use your little wire brush if you got one like this. Little wire brush. Because it's nice because it fits in between there and you can use it to push on it. Push them down so it's nice and square and got a little angle on it. Okay, and then you need to mount your bracket. Some bolts I'll put some anti-seize on it where it goes into the knuckle. This part goes into the knuckle. This part goes into the bracket. And the part that goes into the bracket on the threads, I'll put some Loctite on them, even though they got some lock washers on them. It's just put a little bit on there, not a lot, just a little bit. I put a little bit of anti-seize on there so these don't get bonded inside the knuckle and break next time you do a brake job. Got your caliper brackets on, your bolts, snug them up evenly, and then you want to torque them. That torque is like 60 foot-pounds, but you need to look it up. That could be wrong. Okay, so now they're torqued, and we're good. Just another thing though, if you're reusing the old brackets, you make sure these are not frozen inside there. You want to take them apart to clean them, and then put some silk glide inside here, and then twist them as you're going back in and get them in there. Do not put it silk glide inside here, because that will help prevent the pin from going all the way in like that. It'll be stuck out like this, and then you won't be able to get your caliper on. Okay, new pad, put it in there kind of like that, weasel it in there, push. See how I'm pushing that top clip? Don't want to get it stuck on like that. You won't be able to push it in. When you want to push it in, push that in. Okay, now on the inner pad, you'll have the anti-squeaker. Not anti-squeaker, but the squeaker. Tell you when your pads are low. I always put that on towards the rotating direction of it. If it was on this side, it'd be on the top because it rotates this way. Since it's on the back, it rotates this way, it's going to be on the bottom. Okay, so as I put the bottom in the bracket first, and then I'll find that little clip like that, and I'll push it in, and I'll squeeze the pad in, and the pad's in. So now I'm ready for my caliper. If you're replacing the caliper, make sure when you grab the right caliper that the bleeder is on the top when you mount it. Okay, see the bleeder right there? It's on top. I've seen people actually put them on the right one on the left and the left on the right. And then they come back and they say, I can't bleed it. It's like, okay. All right, so I'll line it up and I'll put my caliper bolts in. If you'd like, you can put a little bit of red Loctite on it. I just put it on there just a little bit. I don't put a lot, I just put a little bit like that. Okay. Okay, I got my caliper on. I started my caliper bolts. I snugged them up and then I tightened them. I tightened these 18 foot-pounds. Again, double check the torque spec. And always double check to make sure that they're tight. Physically put a wrench on them. Okay? So now, I'm gonna take the line off the old caliper and put it on the new caliper. But I don't wanna sit here and lose all my fluid. So what I'll do is I'll pinch the line with some vice grips. You're not supposed to use vice grips, but I do. Otherwise you can go get those little pinchies, and the pinchies never work. That's why I'll use vice grips. So I'll adjust my vice grips so they're not so tight. I don't want to squeeze it on there real tight. I just want a nice, just want to feel some tension on it. See, like right now, that's just a little too tight. So loosen it up a little bit and put it on there. Oh, that felt good. That felt good. So now we'll move our little banjo bolt. Okay, my banjo bolt's a 12 millimeter. Got my line pinched. Not totally pinched, just pinched, so it's restricted. Okay, now we'll move that. Okay, got the bolt out. Make sure no washer stays on there. You want to put a washer on the outside and the inside. See, you got a washer on the outside and on the inside. And when you put this in there, into the caliper, make sure this little piece goes into the hole in the back of the caliper to line it up. And then snug it up and then tighten it and make sure it's not binding. And then you end up breaking the bolt or breaking your line. So just make sure that you're lined up with that pin. Okay. Okay, put the line to the back. Start your bolt. Start it. And once you got it in a couple threads, push the hose against the back of the caliper and find that hole with that little stud sticking out of your line and get it into the hole in the back of the caliper. Once it's in the back, then you can snug up your line. And then you want to torque down your line. That line is like 15 foot-pounds. You double check the torque specs with the manufacturer. And then remove your clamp. I don't know if you noticed, but it was still dripping when I had it off. But, you know, with it crimped, that's fine. I just don't want to drain all my fluid out and create a big air pocket. Next, after your torque is all done on your banjo bolt, then you want to come over here and loosen up your bleeder. What I always do is I always take my bleeder out and I'll put some anti-seize on my bleeder threads. I have a correction on my banjo bolt. My new bolt for my banjo bolt is an 11 millimeter. So also my bleeder is screwed, that's an 11 millimeter. And I put a little bit of anti-seize on it. And then I'll run it all the way in. And I'll leave it loose. I'll leave it loose so it will gravity bleed while I'm doing the other side. Okay, and make sure that your line is not twisted. If it's twisted, take your caliper back off and untwist it. Okay, then once it's bleeding, you know, dripping, you'll want to close it, tap on it with a hammer to vibrate it, to allow the bubbles to come up to the top. Open the bleeder back up, see how much air comes back out. Close it, lower the vehicle back down on the ground, pump your brake pedal, to seat your pads, seat your piston, get it expanded out, get it to where it's supposed to be. Then double check your fluid level, leave your master cylinder reservoir cap off, raise it back up, open your bleeder, Let it drip for a little bit. Make sure there's no air bubbles coming out of it. Tighten it back up. Put your little cap back on. And then you can put your wheel back on. Torque your lug nuts, 90 foot-pounds. Double check your factory specs. Go back under the hood. Double check your fluid level and put your cap back on. And remember, before you put your vehicle in drive or reverse, make sure you have a good brake pedal and it's pumped up. Thank you. For the driver's side, I cleaned up my hub, anti-seized down it, put it on my studs, took my caliper off, pinched my line, remember, not so tight. So now I got my new caliper bracket over here. I painted my surface. If you're using the old one, make sure you clean it up, get all the rust from inside here, paint it. Put some, make sure your pins, slide pins are free. Put some Sil-Glide on them, remove them. Like that, pull them out, put some Sil-Glide in it. Don't put too much in this, and then you get it inside here, you can't compress it. Okay? Put your new bundle clips on it, like we do. Make sure they're sitting flat in the bottom, where they go inside here. Make sure they're nice and flat. I had to find me a bolt to match, because remember mine was missing and the threads were shot. What I mean by threads were shot, it's nice and smooth in there. Don't have any threads. This side's got threads. This one don't have no threads. So now we'll put them in there. Don't forget about your rotor. Don't just put them on. You gotta clean the oil off. You gotta use soap and water, degreaser, or a window cleaner. No brake clean. Okay, so now I'm gonna put my caliper bracket on. Okay, got my caliper on. Started my bolts, snugged them up equally, and then I torqued them to 70 foot-pounds. But don't go by my torque specs. You should always look at your manufacturer's torque specs. I just give you an idea. Okay, remember that bolt. That bolt is a Japanese metric. It's not a standard bolt, and it's a fine thread. So don't be cross-threading. Make sure you get the right size bolt. Thread it into the bracket. Make sure it threads in all the way. Time for the brake pads. Put the back end first, bottom and on the outside in first. See how that's coming out a little bit? Push it in there. Gotta push that. Push up at the same time. Got it? Got it. All right. Ain't going. So, you gotta make sure why it ain't going working right. Okay. Not going. Not going. Let's see. All right, I had to do the top first. It's just hard to do everything with one hand, okay? All right, inner clip pad has the clip and always goes towards the rotation of the rotor. The rotor's going this way, so it's going on the bottom. The rotor's going that way, goes on the top, because it'll be sitting over here. Start the back. Put the bottom in first. Find your clip. Boom. You know, when you find your clip, I'm saying find this clip. Push the pad in as you're pulling that off to the side so it doesn't bind with your pad. Okay, now that's good. So now we can put our caliper on, then put our caliper bolts on. Put your caliper on. This is a new caliper. Wasn't really gonna go on very easy, so I'd take it back out, and I had to push the piston in. Just because it's new reman doesn't mean it's fully pushed in all the time. So remember, force nothing. So now it gets on. It was on there nice and loosely. Started my bolts, snugged them up, tightened them up, torqued them to 18 foot-pounds. You should always double check your torque specs. I just give an idea of a spec. Make sure you double check all your bolts. Now we're gonna work with our line. Make sure you don't have no old copper washers on there. You don't want a double stack. You want one on the inside and one on the outside. Start your bolt in the back of the caliper, and then line up your little pin with the hole in the back of your caliper, and then snug it up and then tighten it up and torque it. See the washers? One on the inside, one on the outside. Okay. Got your banjo bolt into the back of the caliper. Got started a couple threads. Push the line into the back of the caliper. Line that little pin up with the hole in the back. Snug up your banjo bolt. Tighten it up and then torque it to 15 foot-pounds. Make sure you look up the spec. I'll just give you a general idea. Remove your bleeder. Put some anti-seize on it. Put it back in. And just let it gravity bleed for a little bit. You know, don't have it tight. And as it's sitting there, gravity bleeding, take your hammer. Take your hammer. Tap the caliper. That vibrates it, so it breaks loose all the little air bubbles trapped around the piston. And then snug up your bleeder, lower it down, double check your fluid level, put your cap back on, go inside the vehicle, start it up, pump the pedal. You know, that way it pushes out the piston and mashes the pads up. Shut it off, remove the cap, double check your fluid level, raise it back up, loosen your bleeder, let it gravity bleed till you see no more air bubbles, and let them gravity bleed till your fluid comes out a little bit more cleaner, so you're like doing a brake flush. And always double check your fluid level while doing this so you don't run it dry. After you're satisfied, tighten up your bleeder, snug it up, don't break it off. Put your tires back on, lower it down to the ground, start your engine, pump your brake pedal till you have a nice, good, firm pedal before you put it in drive or reverse. And always double check your fluid level when you're done. Thank you. And don't forget, clean it off, some soap and water, degreaser, some Windex, glass cleaner, and then double check for leaks to make sure you don't have no leaks around your brake line or your bleeder or around your piston boot. If it's all good, put your tires on and torque them in a star fashion, crisscross, 90 foot-pounds. Make sure you double check your factory specs. And you're all set. And you're ready to go driving.